You may notice I've shortened my title considerably to fit on this busy introductory slide. But I'm going to try to kind of step back and give kind of a more general overview of the measurement of sensation really in general, although I'll try to use sweet examples preferentially. So this little bit of data, I'm not going to show you this again, but one of these upcoming trials we've discussed, this is a little smattering of pilot data on one of our model foods, though this is a sweetness as a function of sugar concentration in vanilla milks. So this is a preview of what we're talking about, or since Suzanne covered a lot of this anyway. Talk a little bit about the concept of levels of measurement, which we'll weave into the rest of the discussion. Talk about some actual methods used to measure intensity of sensation. And then finally, in the context of this discussion, we'll talk a little bit about some recent large-scale efforts to measure a large number of foods in the diets. One of the people that have done this is sitting there. So at first I was a little bit worried not having really done any of this work. I've been in the position of talking about it in front of people who do. It's like, it's easy to sit here and throw stones. But after reading it, don't really have many stones to throw. It's a heroic effort in scale, and in a lot of ways done very, very well. Okay, so I'm going to beat this dead horse a couple more times about the matrix effects with a little bit different inference. As an experimental psychologist that have dealt often with particularly some molecular biologists and chemists who question whether or not we have a right to exist in the world of science, always kind of emphasize, no, you can't do this with chemistry. You have to involve the human observer. And I'm going to rehash John's data, which are great. I hacked your slide up a little bit to simplify. But so here's this effect where you have the same amount and same concentration of sugar in a water background or in a quinine background, which is the bitterant and tonic, and that was John's take on this, is your tonic water, or your gin and tonic probably has a lot more sugar than you think it does. And that's a good point to reiterate here. So I'm going to so I don't have to set this up, I get to like blather a little bit. So this effect of mutual suppression between bitterness and sweetness is one of the most robust taste interactions that we can observe again and again. And really, this is something that's happening in the brain. So you can paint the quinine on one side of the tongue, and you can paint the sucrose on the other side of the tongue, and you still get the interaction effect, although that both precludes receptor interactions, and those nerves don't even interact, the signals until you get into the brain. So there's nothing you can measure in the matrix that will let you do this. This is something that's happening entirely inside the head of human observers. So that's something I wanted to throw out or re-emphasize. I have a chip on my shoulder about that from past experiences. Yeah. So the other thing I kind of might throw out is kind of an interesting hypothesis that's impossible to test, but it's fun. So maybe it's not like this purely this drive for energy that is exemplified by sweetness, or the urge to avoid toxins, and that's one idea, is that we evolved bitter taste to avoid plant toxins. Maybe what we're really geared to do, and there's brain circuits here geared to evaluate the ratio of those two things. So what you're really looking at is the nutrient to toxic load, and it may be even that based on different needs, you might be willing to accept more toxins and less sugar. So it's more toxins to get your sugar depending on your needs. That's one kind of idea I'll float. All right, so I'm going back to levels of measurement. This is by a psychologist, 20th century psychologist that we'll see again by the name of Stanley Stephens. So he posed 4 levels of measurement, and there's other ideas. So one is nominal. So it's like the numbers worn by runners in a race, and that gives you only identity. You can say A equals B, A does not equal B. You can go one step higher and get ordinal or rank order measurement, and this is like the order of the finishers of a race. Runner A finished before runner B, but that's all you can say. Go one step higher, they call interval measurement, and you can say that runner A finished 2.3 seconds ahead of runner B. So you notice so far that each of these contains all the information of the lower levels plus more information. And if you go all the way to ratio measurement, which includes a true zero or true meaningful zero, Only then can you say that runner A finished 32% faster than runner B. I guess that'd be a huge discrepancy in any kind of real race. But that's the idea, that a beverage, in this case, that's rated at twice as sweet really does taste twice as sweet. And that's the most information you can get. So why do we care about this? By and large, we don't. We being the sensory community, almost any question you can think of can be answered perfectly adequately with ordinal measurement. Especially you've got a within subjects design, or but why might we care in this case? We might, or we might not. It might not be important at all. But we might care because of these issues of we don't know what issues of the dietary sweetness are important. Catherine touched on this, other people touched on this. So what matters? Is it the average perceived sweetness among all foods consumed? What the heck? I'm doing something here. Is it the maximum level of sweetness experienced? Is it the frequency of exposure maybe to some minimum level of sweetness? Is it the range of perceived sweetness? Is it the ratio of sweetness to other attributes, like say this bitter, this bitter-sweet trade-off that seems to be psychologically, perceptually important? We don't know, and we might not know for a while. So if we're going to get a standard method to measure dietary sweetness, it'd be nice to capture as much information as we can. So you notice some of these, to ask the question, involves either addition or subtraction, or division, or to calculate ratios in some of these cases. So the more of the information we could retain, the better. So keep that, file that away. We'll talk about that as we go along. And I'll give you to say that I didn't lead you down the primrose path. We can't prove definitively ratio measurement for any measure. But I'll argue that it's more likely for some than others. Okay. So taking a step back, we can't measure a sensation. We can't observe directly what goes on in someone's head. Even functional imaging techniques like PET and fMRI, they measure regional changes in blood flow. They don't measure the sensation. They correlate it with the sensation. So we can't stick a ruler down next to somebody's head and say, this is how sweet, this is what they feel with any kind of measure. We're really stuck with two options. We can take what are called indirect approaches, or people have typically called indirect approaches, and infer the strength of sensation based on objectively observable behavior in some simple structured task. I'll lay that out in a second. Or we can just ask them to tell us what they feel with some structured report of mental content. And I put those in quotes. I didn't mean them to be sneer quotes, but I want to make a point that, in a sense, there are no direct measures of sweetness at all because you can't directly measure it. But this is the terminology that's used in psychology and the sensory community. Okay. So one influential indirect approach, and this goes all the way back to the 1800s. Really, this whole story encapsulates the birth of modern experimental psychology. So this and related studies is where experimental psychology, as we consider it today, started. So what do we mean by a simple structured task? I can give you 2 cups. One contains water, one contains a variable amount of sweetener. You taste them, and I ask you which tastes stronger, and if you don't know, you have to guess. So we can systematically manipulate what's in the second cup to find the concentration allowing you to achieve a criterion amount of level of performance. It's usually halfway between chance, which in this case is a coin flip in this 2-choice task, and 100% perfect, so this 75% correct would be one common. So when we reach that concentration, we generally call that the absolute detection or detection threshold, and we can plot this on some hypothetical axis of stimulus concentration. This is all arbitrary, but I put out at 1. So that's the threshold for this sweetener, whatever it is, it's 1. Okay, we can take that threshold concentration, put it in a cup, and then give people higher variable concentrations. Their job, again, is to say which is stronger. We find the concentration that allows them to do that 75% of the time. And then now I can plot what this axis that I skipped over was. The y-axis then is number of J and Ds, or just noticeable differences. That's kind of an obvious way to state it. I like it that way. So number of J and Ds above threshold. So now you have another stimulus that's 1 J and D above threshold And that's a 13% change, so it's no accident, as Suzanne said, the 10 to 15, that's kind of why I grabbed that. So we can take that first J&D, put it in another cup, do the same thing, we get a second J&D, put that second J&D, compare it to higher concentrations, get a third. I guess I've over explained this already. So we can do that across a wide range of concentrations. A lot of you will probably look at that and say, hey, that looks like a logarithmic function. And it's no accident because that's what I use in Excel to generate it. But if you integrate this, and it works not just for taste, it works over all kinds of sensations, right? You get something that's roughly a power function or a logarithmic function. This is a simplified version of what's come to be known as Fechner's law after Gustav Fechner, who first measured a function this way in, was it 1850, 1860? And it's sometimes called the Weber-Fechner law because of contributions of another German scientist. Okay, so you can get something that's very orderly. I'm not showing you real data, and there's some deviations at different points that are systematic. So one pro is it's objective. It's based on observable behavior, which I personally like a lot. One question is, are all J&Ds equal? Is it a really valid unit of sensation? And we could nitpick about that and talk about, is it true for some sensations and not others, and what range of the concentrations, what concentrations it's true at or not. I'm going to skip over because I don't think that's important in our context, because there's some serious practical flaws that make this an issue. First, you don't really have any information about absolute tensity except, where is it relative to what you're comparing it to. Does that make sense? So really, you can't have a standard of comparison across all kinds of different foods. An orange and an apple that are perfectly matched in sweetness would still be perfectly discriminable. Is that a serious thing? I'm not sure. Another issue, practical issue, is that it can be unclear what people use to make judgments, and that'll be true of these subjective tasks I talk about later. But especially here. So sweetness is not the only thing that changes with sugar concentration. Appearance can change, and consistency of the food can change. Those are perfectly valid cues, and that plays into what are all J&Ds the same. That could be different, have a different impact on the judgments at different levels of the concentration range. Anyway, but none of this is really, I dwelt on it more than it deserves because there's a fatal flaw in that these are probabilistic judgments, and to get a stable estimate of probability takes quite a few trials. So a partial sweetness J&D or partial sucrose J&D function I saw was based on upwards of 3,600 trials measured in 1981. And that's probably not adequate. That's probably just what they could stand to do because of the chemical senses. There's fatigue, adaptation. So unlike vision and audition, where you can just rip off these trials endlessly, you have to wait in between the cups. So that's probably just what they can stand. So the function that Fechner worked out originally for the heaviness of lifted weights, it was estimated that it was based on just shy of 25,000 judgments. And that's just his function, his individual function. So that caused his American kind of slightly almost contemporary, but the foundational, important American philosopher and psychologist William James to conclude that the Germans lack capacity for boredom, among other things. All right. So here's Fechner again, and I'm going to introduce. Here's a picture now of Stanley, of what they called in the nickname Smitty Stephens, who pioneered really more a second approach pioneered is the wrong word. It had been done for a long time, but maybe worked towards having it gain acceptance, at least in experimental psychology. As far as I know, the first intensity scale actually was a couple centuries BC to assess the brightness of stars. So people have been doing it that way for quite a while too. But anyway, Smitty Stephens founded the influential psychoacoustics lab at Harvard, working mostly in tones, but he did all kinds of things. And one of his main workhorse approaches was magnitude estimation. So here you give, this is one, there's different versions of it, but this is one common version. So you give somebody a sweetener called the modulus. You don't make a judgment, you just note the intensity of it and you assign a number to it. Then I give you variable concentrations of other sweeteners, and your job is to say how strong is that relative to the modulus. If it's twice as strong, you give it a number twice as high. If it's half as strong, you give it a number half as large. They're specifically instructed to make ratio level judgments. Okay. All right, this is what the data look like when you do magnitude estimation. It's a slightly different function. It's a power function instead of a logarithmic function. It works over a wide range of concentrations, not just for taste, but for almost any sensation you could imagine. There's some deviations at the high and low concentrations. Again, I'll talk about that in a second. But again, there were endless fights over the shape of this function. Stephens in the mid 20th century published a wonderful paper with the very cheeky name to honor Fechner and repeal his law. So this has become known as Stephens' law. Kind of a cool thing about this, just as ease of data handling, if you take the logarithm of concentration versus the logarithm of intensity, that becomes a straight line. That's just a property of power functions. So I'm going to use that to set up actual sucrose intensity function that Stephens measured. You notice the deviation at the concavity. You'll see that not just with magnitude estimation, but for almost any task you can use over some range of concentrations. So what happens when your data don't quite fit your model? You start to patch it. You add parameters. And that's done in various ways, and there's various corrections that people have applied. These days, we tend not to use those. We use another kind of function, which adds free parameters. But these are ratings of sweetness intensity for chocolate puddings for the trial we did a little earlier with PepsiCo. It's a cumulative logistic or a Hill equation. It's a 4-parameter function. So you've got the lower asymptote, the upper asymptote, the slope, and so you obviously, give me more parameters and don't make me show the whole range of the function beyond the data, and we can fit things better. But one thing that's neat about this is that it is not purely empirical. This is the function this model is based on receptor interactions, so molecule receptor interactions, and it works really well in molecular biology. Usually, like if you take a taste receptor, put it in a heterologous artificial cell system, and measure dose-response functions, these Hill equations work pretty darn well. So there's lots to like about this, but keep in mind it fits better, but we have more parameters, so of course it fits better. Okay, I'm not going to talk much more about that as we go. That's why I'm not going to fight over the form of the function, because we've moved beyond. So I guess we've repealed Stephens' law in turn, if you want to maybe state it that way. Okay, so going back to ratio level measurement, we asked the subjects to make ratio judgments. That doesn't mean they do it. How can we check? And there's a bunch of really neat psychophysics that I just don't have time to go into, but I can kind of try to voice over a little bit. You can do things like having people match the strength of one sensation to another, like you squeeze a hand grip to match the loudness of a tone, or you set up two tones that have the same to you perceptual ratio of loudness as two other sensations, and you can do all kinds of these judgments. And the models, you can derive like quantitative predictions for how that data should look. And quite often, I mean, I'll give my take. It's highly suggestive, though it doesn't definitively prove that subjects can actually make these ratio judgments. It's another school of thought. So Dr. de Graaf in his dissertation. So you can do other things. You can ask people to judge differences versus asking people to judge ratios. And that also can make quantitative predictions for how those data should be related to each other. And they had data suggestive, though not definitively proving, that maybe what people are actually doing are judging differences, and they're patching that by trying to assign a number that's proportional. So, I mean, we can't say definitively that that's not true. I'll show you one piece of evidence that I find convincing, just personally find it convincing. Electrophysiology. So through a quirk of human anatomy, the chorda tympani nerve, which carries signals from the anterior front part of the tongue, runs through the ear. So you can do cool things like dropping some anesthetic in there and deadening it. Another group in Sweden, they did some really cool things that nobody will ever let us do in Sweden. But they took patients undergoing ear surgery, and they actually skewered the chordotympany nerve with a recording electrode so they could flow solutions over the tongue and measure neural responses. And this is for citric acid and for sucrose. You get basically the same function. Now, the absolute heights of these mean nothing. They're transformed so that they have the same means but preserve the ratio relationships amongst the data. And you get the same answer. So again, that doesn't prove that the magnitude estimation is producing ratio judgments, and I find it suggestive. It's a religious position, not a scientific position, since ultimately we have to make our judgment and take a leap of faith. No, we don't have to. Anyway, more experimental psychologists feel that way. Just as an aside, I think the people in industry and applied have just long ago said, well, we can't definitively prove this, but who cares? We don't need to. We can do almost anything we need to do with a lower level of measurement, and that's generally true. So anyway, okay, so go through some advantages and disadvantages. Doesn't require an obscene number of judgments. So I find that 2 responses after you've given them some warm-up is really good. If you add 2 more, I'd really love 2 on one day and 2 on another, so you can assess stability within between. But really, after you take 2 judgments, you get diminishing returns. And if you get 5, you get really, really greatly diminishing returns after you take 5 or 6. So the data collection is much more rapid, and this is going to be in common with all of the direct or subjective techniques I'm going to discuss. Simple to implement and score. That's again a universal to all of these techniques. Subjective, for what that's worth, that's universal. Possible pro, ratio level measurement. You can believe that or not. If you're a Hatfield or a McCoy, is that too American centric? But at any rate, con, so no semantic information. I mean, maybe you have some information if you use a modulus. You can say it's such and such relative to the modulus, and that's, maybe you can work with that. But some participants kind of report that it's very hard to use, it's particularly lower numeracy. So the technique was developed in the Harvard psychology lab, and that's what, I come from a vision lab originally, and we do that. We all just serve as subjects in each other's experiments. So all their original subjects were Harvard graduate students who were sitting there very nerdly saying, this is a 10 and this is a 5, and so anyway. So that may not be what people with lower numeracy do. So another school of thought, or not a school of thought, but I mean many other people along the way in clinical and applied work were using a different kind of scale where you have a line marked with extremes, and you put a little tick mark in there where you think it goes, where each stimulus goes, and that's has the same pros and cons. I mean, the same pack of pros and cons. You also lose your assurance of ratio measurement, although maybe some of them can. There's been some demonstrations of data consistent with ratio measurement for some line scales. But they're really easy for participants to understand and use, which is a nice pro. Again, no semantic information, maybe even less because you're not anchored to a modulus even. So if you value semantic information, there's an app for that, as the slang goes. Category scales, which have been around for a long time. So in this case, the key feature is that you have a limited number of fixed responses. You pick the one that best matches the sensation strength. And they can get fancier than that. They can have associated numbers with little visual aids to tell you which end is up. But they share this feature of both they're tied to some kind of words that hopefully at least will give you ordinal level data. But notice that you can't at all assume that something that's moderate is twice as strong as something that's very faint. It's completely ordinal. So if you use magnitude estimation as a gold standard, and I will put that in cautionary quotes, that this is category scale on the y-axis, magnitude estimation on the x. They're bowed out. So you could but for sure you could say that either one or both are not producing ratio level data. It could be both that are not producing ratio level data. Have to add that. So the same pack of pros and cons common to all. Spacing of categories are completely arbitrary. They are also very easy for participants to understand and use. And they give some kind of semantic information of the caution that my feint may not be the same as your feint. That's a general caution of all these methods. Anytime we see a difference between individuals, we will never know for sure if it's a difference in what they feel or a difference in how they're using the scale. I mean, we can never know that for sure. All right, resolution among stimuli. So you think, well, if you have too few categories, if in an extreme case it's sweet or not sweet, right? You're not going to have a lot of resolution. There's some concern that, oh, well, maybe you don't have enough categories to really resolve, and that doesn't seem to be much of an issue as long as you have a reasonable number of categories. So some studies, for instance, have shown better resolution with a line scale than a category. Some studies haven't. So my personal take, Suzanne, is that when you get to that, really what's more important is the variance due to your experimental hygiene than any kind of inherent resolution of the scale. But at any rate, so I'm going to tell you about another one. This is a kind of a religion at Monell since it was developed at Monell. But there's a lot I think to like about this. So first of all, it's kind of maybe a hybrid of a line scale and a category scale because it has, you can mark it anywhere, but you have categories with associated adjectives. But the cool thing about the spacing is that Barry Green and his colleagues use magnitude estimation to have people rate the strength of these adjectives. And they're spaced accordingly. It's kind of a quasi-logarithmic spacing. But what does that do? So by using magnitude estimation to space the labels, they're no longer arbitrarily spaced. And you get perfect agreement, almost perfect agreement between magnitude estimation and the GLMS. 2 minutes? Oh gosh. Okay, I'm gonna have to skip quite a bit. All right, so I want to make a quick point. This is some data from John Hayes' lab. Those peaks represent clustering, so people, although they can use the scale, mark it any way they want, the responses cluster around the categories, so at least some people seem to be using this as a category scale. So maybe for some people it's like a ratio category scale, but it makes, I think it has a lot to like. Again, same ratio, same problems. Weak con, you have to do a little more training, so it takes a little time to get people to use this scale stably. And whether that's a con or not, people may use it somewhat like a category scale. So I can fortunately skip over this because Suzanne covered it, of matching to sucrose standards. And I'll make a comment. So pro, easy to score, requires more training. You can have the standards available while people scale, but then if you're tasting too many stuff along the way, that can have its own problems. So ordinal measurement, so you've seen intensity as a nonlinear function of concentration by almost any measure. So stating it in terms of sugar concentrations isn't going to help you in that respect. So it can include an objective component, which I like, because you can include the sucrose standards themselves as things to be matched. And you can actually verify, in that case, with a right or wrong answer, whether they choose the 3% sucrose solution and match it to 3%. So that's quite nice. And there's certainly a less ambiguous language to communicate results than saying something is faint. Does that let you do individual differences? Maybe, but there's a caution here. What if people differ in how they perceive the standards? And I don't know if that'll be true or not, but it could be. The concern is in cases where you have comparisons between groups without random assignment. So that perhaps if there's, say, a difference in how the two cultures the diet of two cultures affects sweet taste, that could affect their perception of the standards. So just because they match standards the same way doesn't mean they're perceiving the same thing. And I don't have a perfect answer to that. I will, though, mention that there is a pretty good way to get out variance due purely in the way that people use scales. There's the concept of the personal exponent, and some people use numbers expansively, some people use numbers conservatively, and you can see them do it across modalities. So the neat thing there is then you can use, hopefully, an uncorrelated modality, have people rate that on the same scale, and you can use that as either a covariate or do other things with it. I'm looking from faces that I may be going a little fast. I was afraid of this. How would you like me to proceed? Skip to?
Keep going.
Keep going,
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, so I don't want to be dogmatic about any of this because but anyway, I thought there's some concepts that are good to raise. All right, so are the subjective measures valid? Yes, in that they all track concentration pretty well. I've shown you that, so I'm not going to show you more. Some other kind of not perfect evidence, but suggestive, is that ratings of intensity reflect characteristics of sensory biology that we can observe with objective techniques. One of my favorites is that ACE-K and saccharin stimulate sweet receptors at low concentration, but at high concentrations they become antagonists. So they have U-shaped dose-response functions at the receptor, and that's reflected in ratings of intensity. And other things are individual differences in rated bitterness associated with differences in the bitter receptors we express. And John's lab has identified a couple of interesting cases of polymorphisms in particular bitter receptors that are associated with individual differences in the rated bitterness of some non-nutritive sweeteners. Okay. Interim conclusions. So indirect measure is valid but objective but impractical, practical but subjective. The direct measures all seem to be valid, so really you can use any of them to an extent, but we might want to think about the level of measurement here, particularly that there may be some questions that we could answer better with a higher level of measurement. Okay. But I want to say, although it's very comforting that intensity faithfully tracks concentration, there's more to it than that you need to consider. So context effects. Two common ones. If you rate a fixed stimulus with stronger stimuli, it's going to get lower ratings than if you rate a fixed stimulus with weaker stimuli. Contrast effect. This shows that for 4 different estimates, so category scale, magnitude estimation, 2 variants of the LMS, for a grape drink with 10% sucrose, and they all suffer from that in the same direction. Another one is the range effect. So you get a flatter function if you rate a given set of stimuli with a broader range of concentrations than with a narrow range of concentrations. Again, all of the techniques do that. So bottom line, you can't regard subjective ratings as a direct estimate of sensation independent of the overall method you use to measure it. So I'll reiterate something that's been said a couple times before, that it really needs to be an overall method that's considered if we're going to do standards. I was going to talk a little bit about odor intensity if I have time, but it's just a few more comments. This is what it looks like in the lab. So I take a nominally tasteless, actually if you plug your nose, it's slightly bitter if it's anything, and add that to a sucrose solution, and you can see a clear increase in rated intensity with concentration, but riding on top of that is a dose response effect for increased level of pineapple. That may be partly a real sensory enhancement, but these kinds of effects are susceptible to method. So if I just ask you to rate sucrose or sugar sweetness, see I'm doing it, if I just ask you to rate sweetness, you're more likely to get these kinds of effects than if I let you rate fruitiness as well. So some people have said that, well, this is a simple scaling bias, that you have a salient odor, you don't know what to do with it, you put it where we let you put it. But if you put peanut odor in there, it won't enhance sweetness. There has to be a congruency, which there is evidence that it's based on learning, learned associations. Also, if I give you instructions that put you in an analytic mode, which means you're breaking down your perceptions into category components instead of reacting to the sensation as a whole, that'll do the same thing. So the idea is that people are willing to call certain things sweet that aren't tastes. So the concept of what, so the subject's concept of what sweetness is matters and is malleable, and it depends on experimental methods. So yet again, response options and methodological details matter. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit less about this, since you're going to talk a little bit more about, okay, so I'm going to skip. I'm going to say that in the context of these discussions, I think the methods that Dr. DeGraff and others have used to measure sweetness of the diet are fairly strong. One problem that we need to talk about is the months of training to get people up to criterion that just a lot of people are just not going to be able to do this. So lots of good things, maybe training with wide numbers of exemplars can give you a more stable context, put you in a more analytic mode so that you're less likely to conflate, say, odor with taste. Lots of good things about this, but little worried about the time it takes. And level of measurement is kind of unclear. Not to say that, that anybody assumes ratio measurement. That's not assumed with these scales. I'm not wagging my finger, and whether or not it's even worth considering, I don't know. I mean, so I'll throw that out as a possibility. So valid to compare across cultures. One concern here is that issue I raised briefly of what if everything, the perception of everything, including the standards, change. So if you're matching to foods or actual sucrose solutions, that could shift as well, possibly. And the issue of naive consumers, Catherine, I think, did a good job with that, so I'm going to leave off. All right, so after rushing through, maybe a third of this, how sweet is the diet? That's a perceptual question. We have plenty of indirect measures that are great, but I just don't think they're going to be feasible. Direct measures seem to be valid. We might want to think about, some offering us more information than others. That said, results of all the techniques depend on methods. So I'll reiterate something Suzanne said, that it's not, just the scale, it's the whole method that needs to be considered. And I'll leave with this, that you have to be a little worried with subjective measures when you're making comparisons between groups with random assignment, without random assignment, or between individuals. And that's just a standard limitation of all subjective techniques. Right, thank you. I apologize for going over time.